Okay, well, hello everyone. It's nice to see you all here. Like Dave said, I'm working here at the Smith Center at the Newberry. And I've greatly enjoyed my time here. I've enjoyed getting to meet some of you all tonight, and I'm excited for our discussion. It's always great to be with a bunch of people who also really care about maps. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So tonight we're going to look at some of Ruth Taylor White's pictorial maps and the many detailed, amusing, colorful illustrations that are in them. And I'm going to discuss how these maps, although they weren't used to make governmental decisions or to chart things like military operations, were still important to the workings of US empire at the beginning of the 20th century. Maps like White's shaped how Americans visualized and understood empire and encouraged white Americans to go out and see those sites of empire for themselves as tourists. Okay, let's see. On April 8th, 1930, Ruth Taylor White set off on her exploration of Hawaii. Newspapers framed her travels in the familiar language of explorers discovering new lands. The Oakland Tribune, for example, announced that White and her sister, Della Taylor Haas, were setting out to begin, quote, mapping something new. As part of their trip, the pair had set their sights on Honolulu, where they, quote, hoped to obtain some local color for their scheme to map the islands. The Hawaii Tourist Bureau in Honolulu had commissioned Ruth Taylor White to create a series of maps for the islands in the Hawaiian archipelago. Each of the maps illustrated the unique attractions of each island and were populated with colorful, cartoon-like figures, as you can probably see from this map. Each was oriented around themes of travel and adventure that would have appealed to her audience of white middle-class Americans at the time. White filled these maps with exciting and new, yet still familiar vacation and leisure activities, marking Hawaii as ready for American tourists. By the time White and her sister embarked on their voyage to Honolulu, Ruth Taylor White had already become a successful illustrator and cartographer. She had started her career in college as a cartoonist, and between the 1920s and 1940s, she began to create maps, or what she called cartographs, of places around the United States for books, pamphlets, magazines, tourist bureaus, and travel brochures. In 1928, she began to work with her brother, Frank Taylor, making maps and illustrations for the books he wrote. In 1929, she illustrated his book, O Ranger, a book about the national parks, and she was commissioned by Western Air Express to make maps of their routes. In 1930 and through 1932, she created maps for the Hawaii Tourist Bureau. And she would continue making maps in the decade to come, including maps for the children's geography book, Our USA, A Gay Geography, which she published with her brother, Frank, and maps for United Airlines transcontinental routes. Though carefully researched, her maps were primarily preoccupied with human faces, emotions, and stories, reflecting both her experience as a cartoonist and the pictorial mapping genre as a whole. Often, when we think about the histories of cartography and exploration, we don't usually think about women map makers in the 1930s, and we don't usually consider pictorial maps. Instead, we might think of maps that look something like this. But Ruth Taylor White's maps still did important ideological work for US empire in the 1920s and 1930s, though they weren't maps that marked expeditions of explorers or maps that marked property lines. By the 1930s, Americans were uncertain how they should view disparate, varied sites of US empire around the world. Maps like White's that promoted tourism and travel were an essential part of the process of making those places seem part of the United States. Even regions that white Americans would have thought of as more familiar or domestic had to be imagined and constructed, like the desert paradise of the Southwest or the broader Wild West. White's maps helped white middle-class Americans imagine and understand these places as part of the greater whole of the United States. And White's maps invited white American women, in particular, to explore and experience places like Hawaii for themselves. Her depiction of white women enjoying sites of US empire built on much longer trends, in which white women's presence in previously foreign, strange spaces made those places seem safe and feel American. Her maps often included racist depictions of people of color, and by replicating ideas about gender and race that were familiar to white Americans at home, Ruth Taylor White's maps taught white Americans places that had once been foreign and strange were now exciting, welcoming, and part of the United States, politically and culturally. Although her maps were not surveys of territory, they still claimed territory all the same. So I'll start with the example of Hawaii. Although the US had formally annexed the islands in 1898 after an unauthorized coup organized by US businessmen and politicians, that did not mean it was a foregone conclusion the territory would become a state or that it would become Americanized. For one, the United States as an empire has never been a unified, coherent political entity across its possessions, but rather an uneven set of agencies, territories, military bases, federally administered lands, and other legal anomalies. The new possessions, places like Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Hawaii, as places like Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Hawaii were called by Americans at the turn of the century, would all achieve a different legal and territorial status in the century to come. Second, the 1930s were a key turning point in the history of Hawaii and the United States. Of the territories the US claimed in 1898, Hawaii was the only one to be made a state of the US, and as such, the islands and its people had to be prepared for assimilation and incorporation between the 1890s and 1950s. Tourism, working with the US military, played an essential role in transforming the islands into a site of a regenerative paradise for white travelers. Experiences sold to white American tourists, like those advertised in White's map, made Hawaii legible and desirable. Third, Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, challenged US control, including with their own cartographic practices that maintained their sovereignty over their land. Kanaka cartography foregrounds aloha aina, or a deep and abiding love for the lands, seas, and skies, and an active state of being that brings together layered meanings of life, political sovereignty, and the rising of the people to protect aina. These relational cartographic principles recognize the interconnectedness of land, flora, fauna, and generations across distant places. In the 19th century, Native Hawaiians and the Hawaiian government strategically incorporated European and American mapping practices to maintain their sovereignty. As early as the 1830s, the Hawaiian monarchy began conducting surveys of the ahapua, or large traditional subdivisions of land that most frequently consist of a wedge of an island. This sophisticated communal land management system, these divisions, okay, well, we'll just go with the mood lighting. These divisions usually consist of a wedge of an island, and they start from the top of the mountains and extend to the shore, including a lowland cultivated area and an upland forested region. Historically, these boundaries had been recorded in oral histories, but after Europeans began to arrive, Kanaka leaders began a selective appropriation of Western technology to pursue their own goal of building a modern state. Eventually, this led to the first mapping of Hawaii by Kanaka in Maui in 1835, and then this large colored map by Hawaiian surveyor and government official S.P. Kalama in 1838. In 1870, the monarchy continued this work by creating the Hawaiian Government Survey to undertake a systemic cadastral survey of the country. The Hawaiian government continued this work even after the US took control, continuously foregrounding the Kanaka sense of place and maintaining native systems of spatial organization in the face of colonization. So, by the 1930s, when Ruth Taylor White arrived, Hawaii was a contested space that Americans were unsure how to approach. White's maps of the archipelago were an ideological and cultural challenge to Kanaka sovereignty and taught Americans how to understand the islands. In her map from 1931 here, she included endless illustrations of white Americans on vacation. The mountains, lakes, and shores of the island are filled with vibrant, colorful drawings of white figures skiing, hiking, surfing, sailing, fishing, and even flying. In this version, which was printed in color by the Honolulu Star Bulletin, White's caption declared that this map was a cartograph that's drawn to my days and nights of adventure in the island of Hawaii. It is called by some the Big Island, and by others the Scenic Isle. I found in the near 300 miles that I motored around its shore that both were right, and if I were asked, I'd add a name, the Big Thrill. In this version of the map, White told her viewers that she herself had experienced the thrills promised by her illustrations, and that they could too. But White also released earlier versions of this map, printed in black and white and designed for the Hilo Chamber of Commerce and the Hawaii Tourist Bureau 1 year earlier. The promises in this map were not as thrilling, and the tone of the accompanying text highlighted that over 30 years after the United States had taken the territory, Americans were still concerned about Hawaii's status. Though White's illustrations were mostly the same as in the color version, this version was more informative and educational, seeking to teach Americans how to understand Hawaii as a colonial possession, not just as a tourist paradise. Rather than illustrating the big thrill, White's cartouche stated she was illustrating the big island of the territory of Hawaii. She emphasized this territory became an integral part of the United States voluntarily and not by conquest or purchase, and that it extends its welcome to all visitors. White included a dotted line closely followed by small steamships that started in Hilo and led to Honolulu. Unlike the later color version, the framing on this version included basic educational facts about the territory. On the bottom right, the publisher included a caption that said Hilo was the second largest city and seaport of the Hawaiian Islands, serving a trade area of 80,000 persons, 80% of whom are American citizens. This language reflected the imperial ideas running through both of White's maps. The earlier version's language even mirrored the language that appeared in reports that accompanied this map in the Committee on Foreign Relations report on Hawaii, talking about Hawaii's strategic importance. The committee had been sent to Hawaii in the late 1890s to explore the contested issue of the annexation of the islands. In a piece titled Hawaii and Our Future Sea Power, the Navy captain, Alfred Thayer Mahan, declared that Hawaii was meant to be claimed by the US. He argued that it was, quote, by no premeditated contrivance of our own, that the United States finds herself compelled to answer a question, to make a decision. He compared this decision to one of the Roman Senate when it decided to abandon its policy to stay on the Italian peninsula. Regarding Hawaii's annexation, he declared that let it not be overlooked that whether we wish or no, we must answer the question, we must make the decision. The issue cannot be dodged. As White would later emphasize in her map, Hawaii had almost inevitably become a possession of the United States, and its people had agreed willingly. The US was not a conquering force, but rather forced to be a decision maker. The other maps of the islands White created for the Tourist Bureau were similar to her ones of Hawaii, the island of Hawaii. In her map of Oahu, for example, she included similar leisure activities that would have been enticing to white middle-class Americans. At the bottom center, a large steamer filled with white tourists arrives at the island, headed toward Honolulu. White illustrated Kanaka Maoli welcoming the ship in various ways, some performing hula on board, some swimming up to it, some playing trumpets aboard smaller boats, and some handing out lei to new arrivals. Near the shore of Honolulu and Pearl Harbor, golf courses, yacht and country clubs, beaches, hotels, bars, and even polo clubs are all labeled, interspersed with drawings of palm trees. With these illustrations, White suggested that Hawaii offered both new adventures and encounters with an unfamiliar people, but also the comfort of mainland attractions like golf courses. The strategy for marketing the islands was reflected in the text she included that said, "This cartograph is lined and colored to the thrills that greeted me when I first touched the Hawaiian Islands some 2,000 miles from America's western edge at the crossroads of the Pacific. In the sun-filled corners of the island of Oahu, you'll find, as I did, a lifetime of high adventure." White and surely the Tourist Bureau hoped to advertise the islands as easily accessible and full of enough adventure to last a lifetime. By marking Oahu as the United States' crossroads of the Pacific, White again called for American tourists to identify Hawaii as American. Whiteness and femininity were also central to underpinning this argument about Hawaii as a restorative paradise for white Americans. Along almost every coast, a blonde white woman appears, approaching the shore either aboard a steamship, a sailboat, or a speedboat, or sitting on the beach, diving into the water, or observing local tourist attractions. The inclusion of white American women exploring this paradise emphasized again to viewers that Hawaii was indeed safe and a convenient, easy place for a honeymoon or family vacation. This map of Oahu also revealed some of the military underpinning and colonial underpinnings present in Hawaii. The non-leisure and non-tourism sites that she included in her map highlighted the other forms of US colonialism at work. A reformatory school for Native Hawaiian boys appears alongside radio towers and a sugar mill. Pineapple, sugarcane, and taro farms are spread across the map. US military and federal infrastructure appear throughout, including illustration of the USGS Magnetic Station, the Pearl Harbor Naval Station, Luke Airfield, Wheeler Field Air Base and Barracks, and a US dirigible mast, which would have allowed for the docking of an airship. At most military sites, smiling and saluting servicemen appear, images that were likely meant to instill pride or patriotism, but also that were intended to be reassuring. Just outside the Wheeler Air Base, White included an image of a focused golfer carefully setting his aim at the base of the mountains. Showing the robustness of military outposts almost paradoxically reassured white American tourists that Hawaii was nonviolent, secure, and safe for travel. Her map of Oahu said that American travelers could depend on American servicemen to make the islands navigable. This theme of tourism backed by the US military was only emphasized in the reprint of her Oahu map published by the Honolulu Star Bulletin in 1935. A new border included 22 insignias of the United States Army units stationed in the Hawaiian Islands. In this image, all the promising adventures to be had in Hawaii were literally bordered by the US military. White's maps of Hawaii showed that the islands were an exciting place, governed by the US and secured by its military, that had eagerly signed up to become part of the US, and that white Americans could use to fulfill their desires for a vacation in a tropical paradise. In White's maps, this system was fundamentally underpinned by race and gender hierarchies, made legible through the image of white women on vacation. Okay, so now some context on the history of pictorial mapping. I'm sure that for many of you here tonight, there are probably pictorial maps that you know and love already, like this map of Chicago by Arthur Erickson, perhaps. And I believe that the Map Society has hosted talks about pictorial maps before. So I'm sure some of you are already familiar with this genre. So this brief history of pictorial mapping in the US may be more of a refresher or a review for you than news. Across the 19th century and early 20th centuries in the US, maps began to be used to make an argument about national unity. As Susan Schulten has explored, beginning in the early Republic era, thematic maps that outlined one national history became increasingly important tools. In the mid-19th century, thematic maps continued to grow in popularity as the federal government created maps to visualize data on soldiers, forts, and their surrounding conditions, as well as population statistics. At the same time, maps became more democratized because of bicycle and automobile maps at the end of the 19th century into the 20th. Cycling manuals began to give out crowdsourced spatial information like the direction of roads, their grade and their condition, and suggested itineraries. This shift to popular map making continued into the 1910s and 1920s with the rise of automobile culture. Promotional automobile maps were incredibly successful in encouraging both tourism and consumption. By 1934, a map publisher executive estimated the annual output of oil company road maps to be 70 million. Pictorial cartography rose to dominance in the American market between the 1920s and 1960s alongside a transforming tourism industry. These maps capitalized on new printing technologies, the democratized market for maps, and Americans' increased mobility. As Stephen Hornsby has discussed, although this style referenced much older maps, this was a new genre that focused on popular narratives about national history, geography, and culture. Though pictorial maps did accurately depict important geographical markers, they largely prioritized narratives over the inclusion of all important geographical features, like the ones displayed here on the slide. Often produced by professional artists as a side project, pictorial maps tapped into artistic trends in popular culture, as their creators were familiar with contemporary advertising, comics, cartoons, and movie posters. Ruth Taylor White's work embodied much of the pictorial mapping genre. Her focus on human characters, emphasized narrative, and her illustration of happy, jolly scenes of the nation matched with the work of other cartographers during the Depression era, who primarily visualized a shared national identity based in nostalgic ideas about abundance, security, and Anglo-American superiority. Design scholar Dory Griffin, who is the only other scholar to have written about Ruth Taylor White in depth, writes that the stories White's maps told and the way those stories were read by contemporaneous reviewers and audiences are revealing of popular American attitudes toward domestic and foreign landscapes, cultures, and people. White's maps were popular among the public and were important to the genre. She was one of the early pictorial map makers to refer to her maps as cartographs, a term that, according to Griffin, would later be adopted by most major map publishers. Her maps of Hawaii that I opened with tonight were estimated to be distributed in the millions, mailed for free upon request to interested travelers, and her cartographs of the island appeared in travel magazines as full-page advertisements and appeared in tourist brochures. Now, I would like to turn to Ruth Taylor White's maps of the entire United States and discuss how her maps connected the differently administered states, territories, protectorates, and places of US empire for white middle-class Americans in the 1930s. Again, by illustrating white women on vacation and enjoying leisure around the world. After the success of her maps for the Hawaiian Tourist Bureau, publishers Little, Brown and Company hired White and her brother to create a children's geography book of America. Ruth created the maps while Frank wrote up the accompanying page of text with information about each state, colony, or territory. Little, Brown and Company published Ruth and Frank's Our USA, A Gay Geography in 1935, and it was considered a critical and commercial success. Ruth's maps in Our USA suggested that going to see the nation was within one's grasp. She focused on top tourist attractions in each place, along with its notable agricultural, industrial, and geographical features. She emphasized history, social and cultural traditions, and illustrated caricatures in each section of the book. Increasingly, by the 1930s, when Americans pictured a map of the places that made up the United States, they were not picturing maps that looked like this one from 1914. Indeed, calling the colonies colonies, as this map does, was increasingly unpopular. Some officials in the 1910s recommended that Americans should instead use the gentler term of territories to, quote, express the relationship between the US government and dependent peoples. Instead, by the 1930s, Americans had become more accustomed to maps that looked like this, or maps that looked like this one. These types of maps, what some scholars have termed the logo map of the United States on the North American continent, had become more recognizable to Americans in this period. At the same time, it had become more unclear to Americans whether or not the colonies in the Pacific or the Caribbean or beyond counted as truly American. Mapmakers like Ruth Taylor White played a key role in helping Americans make sense of those places. Though you might not be able to tell from this logo map here from the opening of Our USA, the Taylors did include US colonies in their book. Ruth's maps allowed readers to construct their understanding of the United States by extending a racial and gender hierarchy across all the different places within the boundaries of the US, regardless of their legal or territorial status. In her maps for Our USA, white characters appeared traveling and exploring, making historic decisions, or as notable figures. Though there are a handful of exceptions, the vast majority of characters of other races appear working, often for white Americans on vacation. Throughout maps in the book, white blonde women appear in every map, relaxing and exploring, and readers would have come to understand that what did or did not count as part of the United States were places linked by this vision of whiteness and femininity. Ruth and Frank put forward this understanding of US empire for their readers in the text that accompanied Ruth's maps. They wrote in their foreword that they meant for readers to absorb small individual stories from each place. We have tried to picture our United States not as one vast place, but as a chain of places, each one a little different from the other. To our shores came men, women, and children from many countries, each seeking a new and better destiny. At the end of the foreword, even as they tried to communicate the scale and the reach of the United States by listing population and area statistics that constituted the nation, they had to abandon their plan, writing, quote, but we recall the old Chinese saying, one picture is worth 10,000 words. And so we tell our story as far as possible with picture maps. Ruth's maps would tell the story of a nation linked as a chain of places across the globe. Though these places may have been different from each other in particular ways, each place was united because it was part of the broader network that made up the United States. Although White's maps reflected popular narratives at the time, they did more than just reconstitute those narratives in a different medium. And here I want to think about the physical form of the book and its maps and how readers would have interacted with it and the meanings those interactions would have produced beyond just the content of Our USA alone. The book called for certain responses from readers. It encouraged repetition. Each of the maps had the same format, color scheme, and similar illustrations, and each of the text descriptions followed a similar structure by including evidence of why each place was significant to the United States. As with her other maps, each of White's maps within this book contain vivid, eye-grabbing illustrations with detailed renderings of each place. This detail called for a close and careful study by the reader to glean the map's full meaning, providing them with distinctive, memorable characters and caricature for them to associate with it. As part of this slow reading process, readers flipped each of the pages from one location to another, figuratively and literally incorporating each as part of a list of places under US control. Ruth and Frank also lay the maps out in alphabetical order, providing a sense that each place was part of a supposedly orderly, controlled, greater whole. As the reader interacted with our USA, they would have slowly built their understandings of what places and people made up the US. By calling readers to interact with the book in particular ways and perform repetitive behaviors, flipping through the pages, reading textual descriptions, and carefully studying detailed, amusing maps, our USA allowed readers to build understandings of US empire not possible through text or image alone. When a reader picked up Ruth and Frank's book, they would have held a wide but slim tome between their hands, likely most comfortably read by laying it flat so that one could turn their head carefully to scan the detailed pages. On the front cover without the dust jacket, a reader would have seen the title, Our USA, A Gay Geography, in jaunty red type spread across a black imprint of the continental US, which again would not have been surprising for readers by the 1930s. The image of the US only takes up a small portion of space, leaving the rest of the cover blank. But upon opening the front cover of the book, a reader would immediately have that image overwritten. The inside cover of the book includes a map of the whole world, which stretches across 2 pages. These images bookended each other and mirrored each other in design. On the left side appears a banner with the words Western Hemisphere, and on the right appears Eastern Hemisphere. Each map had vertical borders that included illustrations of the people in each hemisphere. The bottom was bordered with waves, populated by mer people, and the top was bordered with illustrations of clouds, planets, stars, and even blimps. Amusing illustrations of penguins around the Antarctic, polar bears in the Arctic, and whales swimming in the seas appear alongside illustrations of mythical creatures like sea monsters. And as the eagle-eyed observers among us may have already noticed, this digitized version of the map includes perhaps an even more fearsome creature, perhaps for archivists and librarians, evidence of a once hungry bug. But anyway, back to our main focus. Yeah, exactly. These drawings would have pulled readers in, calling them to view the map more closely after taking in the entire image spread across 2 wide pages. In this first map, on the inside cover, White rewrites her sense of American geography, her reader's sense of American geography. In the 2 banners that met where the pages folded, she included the legend that specified that the US holdings in both the Western and Eastern Hemisphere were those that appeared in black. Suddenly, unlike the front cover, as the reader scanned the map, places beyond the so-called mainland United States would have appeared. Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, the Panama Canal, American Samoa, and the Philippines, filled in with black, stand in stark contrast to the rest of the countries around the world in white. The US is no longer the portion of the North American continent that appears in black on the front cover, but rather stretches as wide as the book itself, with a foothold in every hemisphere. Taken alongside White's inclusion of planets like Saturn and the stars, sun, and moon, along with the wide 2-page spread of US claims, the nation almost appears at the center of the universe. Now, to look at a specific example of one of the territorial maps in the book. As I've said, our USA built a new sense of place that was centered on US empire, which we can see in this section on the Panama Canal Zone, Puerto Rico, and Virgin Islands. In the map and text covering these places, Ruth and Frank connected the entire region of the Caribbean to US history, or what Ruth titled Central America and the West Indies in her map here. As with the rest of the book, the content and physical form of this section work together to build meaning. Ruth's maps were essential to answering questions posed by Frank's text. In his writing, Frank had a hard time explaining the importance of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, though he does state that the region was strategically significant. The Panama Canal Zone, on the other hand, was much easier to explain. Frank wrote that the zone, quote, is a strip of land extending for 5 miles on either side of the Panama Canal, the great ditch dug by the United States for the purpose of joining the Atlantic and the Pacific, and of making it possible for the greatest of vessels to pass quickly from one ocean to the other. The strategic importance of the Panama Canal is almost self-explanatory in this quote. and the bulk of his 8-paragraph description describes the process and challenges of constructing and maintaining the canal. Praising the brilliance of the team led by Army engineers in Panama, Frank wrote, "In 10 years, they pierced the mountains, separated the American continents, harnessed rivers and lakes, and completed the canal. Perhaps the greatest engineering achievement in the world. It cuts almost 8,000 miles off the sea journey from New York to San Francisco." He finished by stating, "The Canal Zone is a United States military reservation." He had much less to praise about Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, instead saying only that Puerto Rico lies directly east of Panama and that San Juan is the oldest city in US territories, and that the importance of the Virgin Islands is due mainly to the fact that they lie near the Panama Canal. Only 2 of the 8 paragraphs touch on Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. In his summary of those places, Frank wrote simply that Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are important as American island outposts in the Caribbean Sea. Ruth's maps of these places filled in the gaps. Where the narrative of history falls short in Frank's description, Ruth's map called for users to imagine a new space within US empire. In her map, rather than focusing on each individual territory, Panama, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands appear nestled alongside the Bahamas, Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, Colombia, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Florida, among others. At each place, regardless of their status as US territory, state, leased land, military base, or even foreign country, white tourists and US military men flood the surrounding areas. In Havana, a white woman with a parasol follows a white man as he heads off to golf. As 4 schooners laden with white tourists descend upon the Panama Canal from different directions, a couple looks on delightedly as a pair of men in Nicaragua fire a cannon their way. Other visitors smile up at people in Jamaica. And at the top, a white woman holding a parasol sits in Florida, overlooking the whole region. In the chain of places that make up our USA, Caribbean countries both within and outside of US territorial control appear admired, visited, or claimed by white figures. This narrative of US dominance in the Caribbean and Latin America reflected longer trends in the history of US empire in the region. The figure of a white woman in Florida, benevolently overseeing the whole Caribbean and its people, called back to the image American politicians sought to put forth about the role of the US in Latin America in the early 19th century. Starting in the early century, US politicians were invested in ridding other European powers from Latin America and cementing US control, eventually through extractive economic relationships. By the 20th century, the imagery promoted by the tourism industry that White included in her map was a key part of this process of expanding US control. Tourism and empire reciprocally shaped each other, and the imaginings of the land as a perfect paradise for tourist resorts and vacation locales would be converted into material policies and military maneuvers. Ruth's map called for her young readers to envision a world and sort it into their understandings of the space south of Florida. Where Frank's text leaves questions about why readers should care about places like Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands and the Caribbean, Ruth's map encourages readers to familiarize themselves with each place, offering colorful drawings for careful study. On Trinidad, people dance and play music. Over Colombia, an over large flamingo soars. On St. Thomas, a man looks sadly at his empty bottle of rum, to name a few illustrations that draw the eye. Readers would have had to slowly scan their eyes across each island to get a full picture of the map so as to not miss any of her amusing drawings, even the places not officially governed by the US. By showing illustrations of white tourists to places like the Panama Canal or Havana or San Juan, and making no distinction between what was an American possession and what was a foreign, independent country, her work encouraged young white readers to imagine themselves going to visit these places one day, making them familiar and open to exploration as tourists of our USA. Ruth's other maps in our USA played on familiar racial hierarchies that were, in part, constructed in North America. She almost exclusively drew Black people alongside agricultural crops and livestock, as working menial labor jobs, or as performers. As you can see in these examples of Georgia and Illinois, throughout the book, the majority of Black Americans are shown harvesting cotton, tending to crops like peaches, performing for white people, or loading cargo onto boats or into warehouses. And Black Americans primarily appear in southern states, in industrial cities that received many migrants during the Great Migration, like Chicago, Skyscrapers, loading docks, and factory warehouses stand in place of Black Americans, while white beachgoers splash happily in Lake Michigan. These illustrations and depictions may not have been surprising or outside the norm for white supremacy at the time. But RUSA taught its readers a particular method of understanding, sorting through, and remembering geography through race and gender. As children flip through the book, these racial hierarchies, in which white people vacation, travel, and explore, and people of color work, entertain, or perform, would have been sorted into the knowledge they learned about each place, building a hierarchy into their understanding of the world that made up RUSA. Altogether, Ruth Taylor White's map suggested to viewers that white Americans were the people who would go out and see the world that was bounded by US power. This world was wide-ranging and made little distinction between US colonies and other US possessions, and sometimes even other countries. Working hand in hand with a growing tourism industry, maps like White's sustained and reinforced US empire. White's placement of white women as tourists throughout her maps suggested the places she illustrated were safe for white American travelers and provided viewers with a vision of the United States that stretched around the world, made knowable through whiteness and femininity. Her maps allowed viewers to rebuild their understanding of political geography through their knowledge of race and gender, and illustrated a network of empire underpinned by white women on vacation, off on grand adventures. Thank you.
Say a little more about her background. You said she was a cartoonist. Did she have any cartography or art courses?
She began as an illustrator for her university's paper, and so that's where most of her like artistic. I forget now, but it was in California. Yeah, so that's where she started, and then pretty early. That was like in the late 1910s, like 1918, 1917, and so then pretty early she got into illustrating maps as well. Yeah.
Thanks, by the way, this is really wonderful. It sounds like she had a pretty long career, had a lot of commercial success through her work. Is it known, or did you cover, did she ever get hired to do any pictorial maps of places outside the United States?
Repeat the question. Oh, okay, yeah. Sorry to the Zoom listeners. The question was, did Ruth Taylor White ever get asked to make maps of, or commissioned to make maps of places outside of the United States? As far as I know, I don't think so. She did make a map. It's in a very different style because it's in a later period, but she did make a map of the Philippines Manila Hotel, for the Manila Hotel. I think it would have been when the Philippines was technically no longer like an official US colony, but of course the US still had military bases there and like exerted economic control. But yeah, so I don't think that she has maps of foreign countries as far as I've come across. Yeah.
What's the history of pictorial maps? Were you the first person to do this, or where do they come from?
So the question was, what is the history of pictorial maps? Was she the first person to make them? Where do they come from? Yeah, so pictorial maps, I mean, having illustration on maps is, of course, a long-standing thing in map making and goes back for a long time, but at least in like the European and traditions. But yeah, in the 1920s, when like the tourism industry started growing, and again, Americans were more mobile because of automobiles and things like that, and they began to have more disposable income. They really take off in popularity because they were really great at promoting tourism because, you know, here are the interesting, unique things you want to see in each place, and so you should come and see them. Yeah, so, and that's in the US context at least. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your talk. I was wondering about, you were saying that one of her messages was unity, and another message was across anything in any of her maps where she might have been encouraging women to travel unaccompanied?
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. So the question was, one of the messages was about unity and encouraging people to travel. Um, did you see any maps where it encouraged white women to travel by themselves? And actually, I didn't include it in my presentation tonight, but in her map for O Ranger, which Frank Taylor, her brother, wrote, and she did primarily illustrations for. She made a map as well for it, but it's only on the inside covers. It's not the same scale as the maps in our USA. There are lots of images of white women hiking by themselves, or like in pairs. And in general, I've seen other pictorial maps that are like focused on women, like maps for women's colleges or things like that, or like important women in US history. But I haven't seen as many examples of white women on vacation, exploring, on adventures, both by themselves and with other people, as I have in her maps. So, yeah.
Style's called pictorial.
Mm-hmm.
I always enjoy when I see these, but there's other photographers that have done this.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So the question was about pictorial mapping, and there's other cartographers who have done this. This is when I regret having so many slides. Okay. But like Joe Mora, who did the one of California there, was extremely prolific and made a lot of maps. And I think you all at one point had a talk about Joe Mora. So yeah, so you may already be familiar. But yeah, there were pictorial maps everywhere made by lots of different people. Mhm. Yeah. Oh, they still had Joe Mora's maps upstairs? Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, I haven't actually seen any of his maps in person, but maybe I'll have to go take a look. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did she do anything after 1935? Continue?
So the question was, did her career continue after 1935? So she did make some maps in 1938 and 1939, one of which was used for the San Francisco exhibition or exposition, like the World's Fair. And seems to have done some more stuff with the Hawaii Tourist Bureau in the 1940s, although I think they might have just been reusing the maps she had already made for them. But she kind of disappears from the historical record, so to speak. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, some of the maps, like this one, I think, oh no, not this one. One of them is from 1941 and is uh, still, I forget exactly what it says. On the map folder, I forget exactly what it says, but some of them seem to kind of reference the war, but yeah, I haven't found much like after the 1940s. Oh yeah, sure. There's a request to see the Chicago gangland map again. Oh. Yeah, I've seen it multiple times at the Newberry now, so I figured people would know it. Yeah.
I'll just note, if you want to learn more about pictorial mapping, you can go online to the History of Cartography Project, Volume 6, and read the entry on pictorial mapping.
Mhm.
I have one question. Cheating. Do you, I'm interested in what if any crossovers there might be between like postcards and her cartographs, because, especially the kind of caricatures of the kind of Black figures and Black people on a lot of the scenes seem very similar to like 1920s postcards from the American South.
Yeah, so I think at least one of her maps for, I think, Western Express was also a postcard, but it had like a little airplane coming off of it too. So that was fun. And then I think for the exposition in San Francisco, that got turned into postcards. But yeah, I think this is the only times they were in postcards. I think most often they were in like tourist brochures and pamphlets. Yeah. Yeah.
Who's doing pictorial maps today? Is it a current thing?
I'm not sure actually. Oh, so the question was who's doing pictorial maps today? Oh, do you have something? Okay. But there's I always think about, they're not really pictorial maps, I guess, but like all the maps of Chicago neighborhoods that people have today, or I think that a lot of the historic maps continue to be popular today and get sold in different places. There was a pictorial map of Mexico City I was looking at that was like being printed all over by many Etsy shippers. So, yeah, but I'll let Dave weigh in on the official cartographers who are doing pictorial mapping today.
So there's one Kiwi, Australian. Do you know Matthew? Is he Australian or New Zealand? Yeah. So there's a guy from New Zealand called Anton Thomas who does a lot of great, large and beautiful pictorial maps that are printed as well as not just images online. There are yeah, that's who comes to mind immediately for me. Yeah, so Stephen, if you wanted to go somewhere other than the History of Cartography project, exactly. Stephen Hornsby's book, Picturing America, is a good place to start.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's not maps of national parks that are like explorer maps of national parks with like things to see in them. That's what an audience member said. They do make them into puzzles, yes. Since I started here, I've seen maps everywhere, and including in friends' homes as like finished puzzles, and I'm like, wow, there were more maps all around me than I thought previously. Yeah.
All right. Are there any last questions? Okay. Well, let's thank Emily. All right, and thank you for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next week.